On the morning of November 22nd, 1718, a man took 5 musket balls and 20 sword wounds to his body and kept fighting. He didn't fall until his head was cut clean from his shoulders. Even then, according to the sailors who watched it happen, his headless body circled the ship's deck once before it finally sank into the water. That man was Blackbeard, and this is how he died. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. To understand the death, you have to understand the man, and to understand the man, you have to go back to where he came from, because almost everything about Edward Teach, the pirate the world would come to know as Blackbeard, was deliberately constructed to terrify. He was born somewhere around 1680, most likely in Bristol, England, though some historians argue it was the colony of Jamaica. His real surname may have been Teach, or Thatch, or Drummond. The historical record from his early life is almost completely blank, which was probably intentional. Pirates did not keep meticulous birth records. What we do know is that he served as a privateer during Queen Anne's War, the conflict that ran from 1702 to 1713, sailing out of Jamaica on British ships that were legally authorized to attack enemy vessels. He was good at it, extremely good. When the war ended in 1713, the British Crown stopped paying its privateers. Thousands of experienced sailors were suddenly out of work, with no skills that translated to civilian life and no money to live on. This was the kindling that lit the Golden Age of piracy. Edward Teach was one of the sparks. By 1716, he had fallen in with a pirate captain named Benjamin Hornigold, operating out of the Bahamas, specifically from the port of Nassau, on the island of New Providence. Nassau at that time was the closest thing the pirate world had to a capital city. Its governor was corrupt or absent, its harbor was sheltered and accessible, and it had become a gathering point for hundreds of former privateers and sailors who had decided that the line between legitimate raiding and piracy was blurry enough to step across without looking back. The historian Marcus Rediker estimated that at the peak of the Golden Age, between 1716 and 1726, there were somewhere between 1,500 and 2,400 active pirates operating in the Atlantic and Caribbean. Hornigold was one of the senior figures of that world, and Blackbeard came under his wing at exactly the right moment. Hornigold recognized something in Teach immediately. He gave him command of a small sloop and let him operate independently. Within a year, Teach had captured a French slave ship called La Concorde and converted it into his flagship. He renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, outfitted it with 40 guns, and began building the most feared pirate operation in the Atlantic world. But before we talk about what he built, we need to talk about what he looked like, because Blackbeard understood something that most pirates never grasped. The most powerful weapon he had was not his guns. It was his image. Edward Teach was a physically imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step back. He grew his beard to an extraordinary length, dark and thick, which is where the name Blackbeard obviously came from. But he didn't just let it grow. Before going into battle, he would weave slow-burning cannon fuses into his beard and light them. The result was a man who walked into combat with black smoke curling around his face, his eyes wild above the burning beard, looking for all the world like a demon that had climbed out of hell and decided to go sailing. He wore a broad-brimmed hat. He carried multiple pistols strapped across his chest in a leather bandolier, so many that he could fire several in quick succession without stopping to reload. He wore a long coat and heavy boots and carried a cutlass that witnesses described as enormous. He understood what we might today call psychological warfare. If you could make your enemy so terrified that they surrendered before a single shot was fired, you didn't have to risk your crew in a fight. You got the cargo, you got the ship, you got everything you wanted, and everyone went home. Blackbeard was extraordinarily successful at this. Many of his captures were entirely bloodless. Merchants would see his flag, see the black smoke from his beard, hear the cannon fire across their bow, and immediately lower their own colors and surrender. Between 1716 and 1718, Blackbeard operated across an enormous territory. He raided along the American colonial coastline from Virginia down to the Caribbean. He took dozens of ships. He accumulated a small fleet of vessels operating under his command. He was, by any measure, the most successful and most feared pirate of his era. The Blockade of Charleston in May of 1718 deserves its own moment because it was one of the most audacious acts in the entire history of Atlantic piracy. Charleston, known then as Charlestown, was the most important port in the American South. It was the economic engine of South Carolina, handling enormous quantities of rice, timber, deerskins, and naval stores that flowed from the colony's plantations and forests to markets in Britain and Europe. To blockade it was to strangle one of Britain's most valuable colonial possessions. Blackbeard did exactly that. He positioned his fleet, 4 vessels in total at that point, at the entrance to the harbor and simply stopped all traffic in or out. Ships attempting to enter were seized. Ships attempting to leave were seized. He held the port hostage for approximately a week, during which time no commerce moved in or out of Charleston at all. The economic damage was immediate and catastrophic for the colony's merchants. His demand was not gold or silver. It was medicine. Specifically, a chest of medicines from the colony's apothecary, which his crew apparently needed desperately. The exact nature of the illness or injuries requiring treatment has never been definitively established, though historians have speculated about everything from venereal disease to wounds from previous engagements. Whatever the reason, Blackbeard sent hostages ashore to make the demand clear and threatened to execute them if the medicine was not delivered. The governor of South Carolina, Robert Johnson, had no real choice. He sent the medicine. Blackbeard released the hostages, released the seized ships, and sailed away. He had just humiliated the entire colonial government of South Carolina in front of every merchant, sailor, and official on the eastern seaboard, and he had done it without losing a single man. The message this sent to every other pirate operating in the Atlantic was enormous. If one man with 4 ships could shut down Charleston for a week and walk away with exactly what he demanded, what were the limits of what a well-organized pirate force could actually accomplish? And the colonial governors of the American seaboard were becoming absolutely desperate to stop him. The problem was geography. The Carolina coast and the waters around the Bahamas were a pirate's paradise. Thousands of small inlets, shallow sandbars, hidden coves, and narrow channels where large naval warships simply could not follow. Blackbeard knew these waters better than anyone. He would raid out from his hideouts, strike a merchant vessel, and then disappear into channels where no pursuing warship could follow without running aground. In the summer of 1718, something changed. Blackbeard accepted a pardon. The British Crown, desperate to clean up the piracy problem in the Atlantic, had offered a general pardon to any pirate who surrendered before September 5, 1718. Blackbeard accepted it and settled in Bath, North Carolina, which was the colonial capital at the time. The governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, welcomed him warmly. This was not purely out of goodwill. Eden was almost certainly taking a cut of Blackbeard's plunder in exchange for his protection and legitimacy. For a few months, Blackbeard lived something resembling a normal life. He married a local woman, his 14th wife by some accounts, which tells you something about how much of his personal life was conducted at sea and out of legal scrutiny. He drank in Bath's taverns and moved through colonial society with a swagger that nobody dared challenge. He was theoretically a reformed man. Bath itself was a small and slightly desperate colonial town, more ambitious on paper than in reality. Its citizens ranged from serious merchants and planters trying to build legitimate businesses to a significant number of people who were perfectly happy to look the other way when a pirate brought interesting cargo through town and sold it at prices far below what legitimate trade would offer. Blackbeard fit into the economy of Bath like a dark hand fitting into a dark glove. But the raids didn't actually stop. He moved his operations with slightly more discretion, using legal cover from Governor Eden to claim that his prizes were legitimately seized vessels. His neighbors in Bath were not fooled, the broader colonial world was not fooled. And most importantly, the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, was absolutely not fooled. Spotswood was everything Eden was not. He was an unusually capable colonial administrator, a former soldier who had served at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704 under the Duke of Marlborough, and a man with a genuine commitment to building Virginia into a functioning and prosperous colony. He was methodical, politically connected, and deeply alarmed by the way Blackbeard's continuing operations were poisoning legitimate commerce along the entire American coastline. Merchants were refusing to sail certain routes. Insurance costs for ships operating in the region had skyrocketed. The economic damage was real and spreading. Letters from frustrated merchants were piling up on his desk. He decided to do something about it on his own authority, without waiting for London's approval and without relying on North Carolina's compromised governor. He hired 2 naval officers, Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy and another officer to command a second vessel. He gave them 2 small sloops, shallow drafted enough to follow Blackbeard into the inlets where larger warships couldn't go. He authorized them to find Blackbeard and kill him. He reportedly put a bounty on Blackbeard's head of 100 pounds, which was a very substantial sum at the time. There was one problem. Spotswood was not technically authorized to conduct a military operation in North Carolina. He was Virginia's governor, not North Carolina's. What he was doing was arguably illegal under colonial law. He knew it, Maynard knew it, and they didn't particularly care. By November 1718, intelligence had placed Blackbeard at Ocracoke Inlet on the outer banks of North Carolina. Ocracoke was perfect pirate territory. The inlet was shallow, the channels were narrow and treacherous, and the geography made it nearly impossible to approach without being seen. The sandbanks shifted constantly, and the channels that cut through them were only navigable to someone who knew exactly where they were. Blackbeard knew. He was anchored there with his vessel, the Adventure, and a crew of around 25 men. He had been drinking heavily with other pirates over the previous days. A man named Charles Vane, another notorious pirate who would himself be captured and executed a few months later, had been anchored nearby, and the two had held what accounts describe as a days-long party of drinking, feasting, and the kind of raucous celebration that only men who live at the edge of violence tend to have. On the night before the battle, an account that has survived suggests that one of Blackbeard's crew asked him if his wife knew where he had hidden his treasure. Blackbeard reportedly answered that nobody knew where his treasure was buried but himself and the devil, and the one who lived longest should take all. It is the kind of line that sounds too perfect to be entirely true, but it survived because it captures something real about the man. He trusted nobody completely. He kept his own counsel in the end. Maynard set out from the James River on November 17, 1718, with 2 sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, and a combined crew of roughly 60 men. He kept his vessels dark at night to avoid detection and moved carefully down the Virginia and Carolina coast toward Ocracoke, staying close enough to the shore to navigate but far enough out that he wouldn't be spotted by anyone who might alert Blackbeard. The night of November 21st, Maynard anchored outside the inlet and waited for dawn. He did not have to wait long to be spotted. Blackbeard's lookouts saw the sloops as daylight broke on November 22nd. Accounts of what Blackbeard said when he saw them coming vary. The version most often cited, though its precise accuracy is disputed by historians, has him declaring that he would give no quarter and take no quarter, which in the language of the era meant a fight to the absolute death with no prisoners and no surrender. Whether he actually said those words or not, he clearly meant them. The Battle of Ocracoke Inlet began in the early morning of November 22, 1718. Blackbeard had a smaller force than Maynard, but he had one significant advantage. He knew the channels. He started the fight by maneuvering the Adventure through a narrow passage, trying to get clear water to run if necessary. Maynard's lead sloop, the Ranger, ran aground on a sandbar in pursuit and was effectively removed from the battle. Blackbeard immediately turned and fired a devastating broadside into both of Maynard's vessels, killing and wounding a large portion of his crew in a single volley. The Ranger's captain was killed. Maynard's sloop, the Jane, was badly damaged, its deck covered in dead and wounded men. By any rational military calculation, the battle should have been over. Blackbeard had every advantage: more guns, local knowledge of the water, and a crew that had just watched their enemy's ships be shattered by cannon fire. But Maynard was not done. He made one of the most cold-blooded tactical decisions of the entire Golden Age of Piracy. He ordered his surviving crew below deck. He ordered them to stay hidden. From the deck of the Adventure, looking across the water at the Jane, it appeared that Maynard's vessel was nearly crewless, a ghost ship drifting on the morning water with only a handful of men still visible. Blackbeard took the bait. He brought the Adventure alongside and led his crew across in a boarding action. This was the kind of combat that suited him. Close range, brutal, hand to hand. He stepped onto Maynard's sloop with his pistols charged and his cutlass drawn, his beard wound with its smoking fuses, every inch of him the image of organized violence. Maynard's men came up from below. What followed was described by contemporary accounts as one of the most savage close-quarters fights in the history of the Atlantic. Blackbeard immediately targeted Maynard himself, clearly identifying him as the officer in command. The two men shot at each other. Maynard's ball struck Blackbeard. Blackbeard's ball missed. They then drew blades. Blackbeard absorbed wounds that should have killed him. A musket ball hit him. Then another. His men were fighting and dying around him on the cramped deck of the Jane. He took a sword cut across his body. He kept fighting. The accounts from men who were there describe a quality to his endurance that they struggle to explain with natural language. He fought as though the wounds didn't register. Another sword cut, another shot. He was still on his feet, still swinging, still terrifying. The forensic accounting of Blackbeard's final moments, reconstructed from multiple witness accounts, suggests he took somewhere between 5 and 6 musket balls and no fewer than 20 sword wounds before he finally went down. Some accounts say it was a sword cut to the neck that ultimately ended it, delivered by one of Maynard's sailors when Blackbeard paused for a fraction of a second. Others say he finally fell from blood loss when his body simply could not sustain enough pressure to keep him upright. What is certain is that Lieutenant Maynard cut off his head. He hung Blackbeard's head from the bowsprit of his sloop, the long spar that projected forward from the bow of the vessel, and sailed back to Virginia with it dangling there as proof. Spotswood had asked for evidence that the job was done. Maynard brought the most unmistakable evidence possible. The story that Blackbeard's headless body swam around the ship before sinking is almost certainly legend rather than fact. But the fact that people believed it, that sailors who were there reportedly told the story in absolute seriousness, tells you something essential about the man. He had spent 2 years convincing an entire ocean that he was something beyond human. When he finally died, even the manner of his death had to be extraordinary to fit the legend he had built. Blackbeard's surviving crew were taken back to Virginia and put on trial in Williamsburg. Most of them were convicted and hanged. Their bodies were displayed at various points along the colonial coast as a warning to anyone considering a life of piracy. The aftermath extended beyond just the men who sailed with Blackbeard. Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina was investigated for his relationship with the pirate, but ultimately cleared. Spotswood, despite technically having operated outside his legal authority, was celebrated. The Virginia Assembly passed a special resolution praising his actions. Maynard was promoted. The effects on piracy along the colonial coast were immediate and dramatic. The death of Blackbeard, combined with a broader naval crackdown that had already seen pirates like Stede Bonnet captured and executed in the same period, broke the back of the Golden Age of Atlantic piracy. Within a few years, the great pirate enterprise that had flourished on the Caribbean and American coast for nearly 2 decades had largely collapsed. But the legend did not collapse. It grew. Within years of his death, stories about Blackbeard were circulating in pamphlets and broadsheets across England and the American colonies. A writer named Captain Charles Johnson published a book called A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates in 1724, just 6 years after Blackbeard's death. His chapter on Blackbeard is the primary source for almost everything the modern world believes about the man. Historians debate how accurate it is. Some of it is almost certainly embellished, but the core narrative, the beard, the fuses, the dozens of captures, the final stand at Ocracoke, all of it survived because the man himself had been exactly as theatrical and terrifying in life as the legends claimed. His flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge, was found in 1996 in the waters off the North Carolina coast, where it had run aground in 1718. The wreck has been extensively excavated over the following decades by teams from the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Archaeologists have recovered cannons, anchors, medical instruments, navigational tools, personal items belonging to the crew, and thousands of artifacts that have helped fill in the historical picture of how Blackbeard's operation actually functioned day to day. The ship is now one of the best documented pirate vessels in history, and the excavation continues to yield new discoveries. There is something almost poetic about the fact that Queen Anne's Revenge, the instrument of so much terror and chaos, ended up preserved by the very waters it once terrorized, waiting quietly on the seafloor for 3 centuries until historians could finally come and listen to what it had to say. Ocracoke Inlet itself is still there. You can visit it. It is a quiet stretch of the Outer Banks today, popular with tourists and birdwatchers, utterly unlike the bloody water it was on the morning of November 22, 1718. There is a local tradition that says Blackbeard's skull was eventually made into a silver-lined drinking cup used by the members of a secret society at the College of William and Mary. There is no credible evidence for this, but the persistence of the story says everything about the grip Blackbeard has maintained on the popular imagination for 300 years. He was not the most successful pirate in history by total value of plunder. He was not the longest operating pirate. He was not even necessarily the most dangerous. But he understood something profound about the relationship between fear and power, about how a man's image, carefully constructed and ruthlessly maintained, could become more powerful than any fleet of warships. He turned himself into a symbol. And symbols are nearly impossible to kill. It took 5 musket balls and 20 sword wounds and a sword through the neck and finally decapitation to kill the man. The symbol never died at all. Edward Teach built himself into something more than a pirate. He built himself into a nightmare. 5 musket balls, 20 sword wounds, and a severed head later, his legend only grew larger. 300 years on, Ocracoke Inlet is quiet, Queen Anne's Revenge rests on the seafloor, and Blackbeard still haunts every story ever told about the Golden Age of Piracy. If this story kept you hooked, hit subscribe and catch the next one.